Okay, I think we're going to get started. Okay, thank you. So thanks for coming, everyone. I'm going to introduce Emily. Emily's going to read a piece, and then I'm going to ask her some questions, and you guys are going to ask her some questions, and I'll ask her some more questions. And yeah. Okay, so TV is something we find ourselves in. Our preoccupations and perspectives, our senses of humor, and our aesthetic, ethical, and political values. TV criticism, at its best, functions to enable and even deepen this process. Emily Nussbaum is the best of TV criticism. Reading her reviews is an unfailingly edifying experience. She locates and gives language to my most oblique and inaccessible feelings in ways that would make my therapist downright jealous. She demystifies my favorite moments, making my passions, interests, and emotional investments clearer to myself. In part, I think this speaks to my own identification with Emily's thematic preoccupations and political ideologies. For example, I think we are both concerned with TV's gender politics and seem to take a particular interest in women in comedy. She writes beautifully about some of my favorite shows, including Louie, Mad Men, Orange is the New Black, and Transparent. She vocalizes almost precisely my personal investment and complicated feelings about girls, and she has single-handedly reclaimed Sex and the City from a guilty to a legitimate pleasure for me. But I think more so, it speaks to her talent as a critic. Her incision, candor, and eloquence engender these feelings in thousands of readers worldwide, made apparent by her massive fan base and truly impressive Twitter following. One of Emily's most obvious projects as a TV critic is to reclaim the medium from its historically marginalized position. In doing so, she is problematizing larger categories of highbrow and lowbrow culture and is celebrating and supporting an increasingly important and relevant form. Supporting TV does not mean being uncritically reverent, however. In her review of the 4th season of Louie, she talks about the show's backlash. The rising debate struck me as useful, she says, a model for how crucial it is to extract the medium from the bear trap of golden age rhetoric, in which respect for an auteur equates with worship and TV becomes church, where everyone is shushing the non-believers. To me, this quote is telling not just of Louie, TV, and the zeitgeist, but also of Emily's critical abilities. Her previous reviews of Louie were, in her words, almost psychedelically positive, and this shows an admirable capacity for both self and rhetorical awareness. Through reading Emily's reviews, we may figure out why we love the shows we love, what specifically resonates with or touches us, and what that might mean. She has given us the language in which to express our love of TV. Her writing has the power to intensify and validate all of our feelings about the shows that have been most important to us. Obviously, I am so excited to have her here with us tonight. Please welcome Emily Nussbaum.
Thanks for having me. This is really fun. This is a very nice place, and I just want to thank everybody for inviting me. I was planning to read a different piece, my Good Wife review, that I had printed up very nicely right outside Penn Station on my way here, and I had all these plans and reasons that I was going to read this. And I have to say, I've actually never read my work aloud before. I've done sort of big picture presentations, like PowerPoint presentations about the history of television, all these big ideas, but criticism by nature has this very ephemeral quality. It's responding to certain moments in the TV show. So I'm curious how things hold up when you read them out loud. I think it depends on the piece. But I was going to read this, but then we were having this whole conversation, and it started centering a little bit around various things, including girls. And I suddenly wondered whether I might read a different piece that I wrote very quickly online for the New Yorker blog that I wrote actually after a different review that I'd written of girls in the 2nd season of the show. And I wrote it for a very specific reason. First of all, I'm proud of the essay I wrote about girls in the 2nd season. I feel really good about it when I revisit it, which I don't about every column. But it was a very intellectual piece that was really trying to situate girls in the larger picture of women's literature and all of these kinds of things. And then the episode One Man's Trash ran. It's the one where, if you watch the show, where Hannah goes and she sleeps with this guy Josh or Joshua at his beautiful brownstone. And it got the most deranged responses online. And there was actually this terrible Q&A on Slate where these two guys were talking about it, and they were so, to me, deranged with their confusion and anger at the idea that from their perception, like an ugly girl would be sleeping with a super hot guy, that completely swamped their responses to the episode. And in the way that you can online, but you can't in print, I felt like doing an immediate response to that. And part of it was actually just for me, because I felt like I'd written this kind of abstract thing, and I wanted to write something more emotional and more specific, and that talked also explicitly about sex, which is such a big part of the show and I think very difficult to write about, but also such a big part of cable television. It's like the big change in cable television, among other things, is the fact that you can actually talk about adult things and show them explicitly in a way network never could. So anyway, I'm going to read this piece and then we're going to have like a larger conversation, and we'll see whether reading blog posts actually works. It has the very simple title, That Sex Scene on Last Night's Girls. Last week I wrote a column about Lena Dunham's HBO show Girls. I had a bunch of abstract, cranky intellectual goals. I wanted to pluck girls out of the debate about millennials, for starters. I wanted to analyze its critical reception. I wanted to put the discussion of privilege in a different light. And I wanted to talk about girls specifically as television. But that's just one way of doing criticism, and last night's excellent episode, One Man's Trash, deserves a more direct response. In TV terms, this was basically a bottle episode set in one location. After an opening scene in which Ray throws a huge tantrum, the rest takes place inside a pretty Greenpoint brownstone, and it's about a 3-day affair that Hannah has with a 42-year-old doctor named Joshua, played by Patrick Wilson, who's separated from his wife. But for me, the whole thing came together in the episode's final scenes. When everything's over and Joshua has left for work and Hannah is alone in his house, she does a few things. She gets the paper from the stoop. Then she reads it while eating toast with jam instead of, say, snooping. Jessa would probably have burned, this is a parenthetical, Jessa would probably have burned the house to the ground. Marnie would have left a day earlier. Shoshana would have been so confused that she might have ended up as the guy's second wife. Then Hannah makes the bed. She takes out the garbage and puts it in the correct can. She walks home. All of this takes place with only musical scoring, as does an unusual amount of the episode. It's beautifully directed by Richard Shepard. What Hannah does is adult and responsible, and it's notable that she does it after a crash course in intimacy, which begins with her dreamlike impulse to pursue a handsome stranger, ends with a vulnerable fiasco of a speech, and is punctuated by her refusal to call the guy Joshua instead of Josh, no matter how many times he asks. Yet the experience is a meaningful one, and it changes her in ways that won't necessarily be visible to anyone she knows. For all her Daisy-like charm, Hannah really can be amazingly solipsistic. She pushes for intimacy and confessions, but when Josh tells her a childhood sex story, she brushes him off. She can't imagine how a 40-something doctor might feel after a divorce, or why he might not want to share. Her idea of closeness is more like a car crash. On the other hand, Hannah is not exactly wrong to think there's something strange going on here, because in 3 days, the pair create something powerful. As if extending a dare, they egg one another on to stay, play ping pong half naked, eat, relax, come look at the moon. Similar to last year's episode in which Hannah went back to her hometown, the episode rejiggers the series' basic structure, and it reminded me, as Girls often does, of Louis C.K.'s jagged FX series Louis, another comedy that takes regular structural risks, including the risk of not being funny. There's something else in the episode too, which I'd never seen on television, and it felt more graphic than the theatrical kink delivered with numbing regularity on cable television. And here I'm going to describe the scene graphically because it's the only way to talk about a sex scene of this type. The first time that Hannah and Josh have sex, we don't see it, just the aftermath, as they dress and exchange data, which is mainly that he's married but separated. Their second time is different. Joshua tugs off his shirt, then lies back on the bed. Hannah unbuckles his belt, and she ducks down to the right of the camera, out of the frame. Joshua gazes at the ceiling, closes his eyes, and mutters, "I want you to make me come, okay? Make me come, Hannah." Patrick Wilson is a gorgeous guy, and it's a sexy scene. It's also a reasonably familiar scenario, since we've seen plenty of men get blowjobs on adult dramas and comedies. But Hannah flips it and reverses it. She rises into the frame and softly asks Joshua to make her come instead. He does, using his hand. The camera doesn't cut away. Instead, it drifts even closer to their faces as they kiss. This is the opposite of the sex that we'd seen between her and Adam, in which Hannah scrabbled to follow his lead, or to negotiate, not there, or pick up clues to his fantasies. Hannah may be self-centered, but in bed, she's almost slavishly generous, and in a superficial sense, the model of good giving and game, Dan Savage's playbook for grown-up sex. With that nice pharmacist in her hometown, she took that bravado so far he finally had to growl, "Come on," to get her to stop spooling out fake fantasies. And while Hannah apparently told Adam that he made her whole body feel like a clit, you have to wonder whether that was the truth, or if it was Hannah's way of convincing herself that even though Adam never paid all that much attention to that part of her body, anywhere he touched was okay. Either way, the short, potent sequence was a departure from any sex we've seen so far on Girls because it wasn't played for laughs. It stood in contrast to the first season scene of Marnie rolling her eyes at her attentive boyfriend, and also with the second season scene of Marty getting slammed into the starfish position by a pretentious detached lover, and maybe enjoying the novelty since he demands nothing. In fact, the Hannah-Josh scene was so intimate that it felt invasive, raw and odd and tender. That's a nearly unheard of quality in sex on cable television, which consists largely of the same cynical motifs recycled again and again. Perfect lingerie, interchangeable young female bodies, while male body types vary wildly in age and shape. The sort of porn with purchase that studs prestige series from Boardwalk Empire to House of Lies. Anyway, afterward, and after Hannah faints in his fancy shower, their placid affair peels apart. She starts having therapeutic revelations, half truth, half grandiosity, which Josh tolerates with a pleasant but distant smile. She keeps pushing these conversations, as she often does, using intimacy as an extreme sport. And maybe as a punishment for Josh for letting her in and for begging her to stay after she begged him to beg her to stay. Basically, for offering a fantasy of steak in the refrigerator and sweaters that cost as much as her month's rent. That's not something Josh can really offer, so maybe Hannah had to bite her own arm off to get away. The whole thing reminded me of an old quote, a fake quote from Lenin, but just because it's fake doesn't mean it isn't useful. The emotions are not skilled workers. At the moment, this is my new favorite episode, or would be if I didn't hate lists. It made me think of the chorus of critics within Girls, like Ray, who lectured Hannah that intimacy wasn't a legitimate subject for art, or Sandy, who said that nothing happened in Hannah's essay, that it was about, quote, all the nonsense that goes through your brain when you're just trying to kill time. Ray or Sandy might dislike this episode or be bored by it. I'm certain it will have its haters. And actually, maybe One Man's Trash, the perfect title, was the essay that Hannah gave Sandy, the one she defensively described as the story of how a girl's whole perspective on who she was and her sexuality changed. But what has two thumbs and really loved the episode? This critic. Anyway, that was my response, and it's weird to read it. Thanks. It is really weird to read it out loud because, of course, when you write blog posts, even though everything I write goes out online, a blog post, I think, requires a more conversational tone, but not so conversational that I'm actually reading it out loud. So it felt a little bit strange, but I remember being very excited by that because it really felt like an opportunity in a way that is not always possible to kind of enter into a conversation, which is one of the things I love about that show and many different shows, is the fact that they're not just a locus point for people sitting and watching them, but they basically have this loop of dialogue that goes on around them. Mm-hmm. But I have to say, the one thing about reading that is I think sex scenes on TV have actually changed a lot since that episode, which is weird because it wasn't that long ago. But I can actually think of a lot of scenes on other shows, including Transparent, right, which we're going to spend the entire time talking about. Yeah. So in case you didn't come just to discuss the episodes of Transparent, you'll probably leave. But anyway, so that's...
Yeah, and certainly Girls is a show that there's so much of a conversation about.
Yeah, to an extent that's actually slightly absurd, brutalizing. Yeah. And I think people are a little sick of it, which is one reason I was hesitant to read it. But I do think that it's interesting in the context of thinking about what criticism does
Right,
and the
right.
different choices you can make
Yeah.
as a critic in responding.
Right. Like we were discussing upstairs about how like in order to write anything or talk about girls at all, you have to like swim through this like pool of like inane rhetoric around it and like
Or
pick
legitimate
out,
things.
or
Like, it's
legitimate
just
rhetoric.
but it's like surrounded by
Yeah.
briars.
And make like disclaimers about like what you don't think is legitimate, what you do, and then
Yeah.
talk about the show.
Yeah.
Which sort of brings me to a question I have for you, which is that like the TV is in a moment where it's maybe more popular, or like it's increasingly popular. It's you know, it has a rising popularity, and with it, and like cult-like followings of TV shows, and a rising popularity of the criticism of it. And does it feel like does it feel hard to talk about something that so many people care so much about?
You. No, I really feel very lucky in this way. I mean, I do. I've talked about this before in interviews and stuff, but the origins that I have as a TV critic are about a show that I was basically a fan of rather than a watcher of, and it was right around what I would mark as the beginning of, God, I can't believe it's 2015 because this is 1999.
Right.
You know, when The Sopranos and Buffy the Vampire Slayer were both on television. I've said this before about this, but it was also the moment the internet really started becoming a thing, and I feel like the growth of TV and conversation about TV is all connected with the change in digital distribution and how the nature of fanhood and conversation changed online. And at the time I was on Television Without Pity, which doesn't really exist anymore, or might in some zombie form, but, which was a discussion site. But what I was really driven crazy by was I loved The Sopranos, and everybody was talking about The Sopranos, and it was always in the New York Times. But I also loved Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I really started to get a huge chip on my shoulder because
Right.
nobody was talking about it in the same way, and it required a kind of evangelism to actually explain why it too was ambitious television. So I feel like I didn't actually become a TV critic until a few years later, but that sort of fueled this feeling. And right now it does feel like there's a bunch of really great critics, but there's also a bunch of people online who are passionate viewers who you can find all over the place, and now people have access to it, which is just
Right.
different. Because, I mean, TV has been popular in different ways for a long time, but it used to be thought of as a solitary experience, and now it really is not for many, many people.
Yeah, there's so many different kinds of TV criticism. Like there's the AV Club model of like the episode recap.
Right.
There's like what you do, which is more like essayistic, long form journalism about it. Do you think that there's like an ideal way to critique?
Well, a lot of
TV?
this, I mean, for one thing, I've written recaps, and you
Yeah.
write recaps, right? Or somebody, yeah, do you?
Yeah,
You recap?
not in the same way. But,
No, there's a lot of, I wrote recaps. I hated writing recaps. I think some of my recaps were good. I think it's a brutalizing but really powerful way of writing about TV. I mean, somebody wrote a history of the recap, which was really fascinating, because it is actually a very interesting online forum, and there's all different ways of doing it. But I had such a miserable time doing it, and I'm just a very lucky person to have gotten this job, which was a rare job where the job is to write long essayistic
Right.
pieces. But the reason that people don't do that much more is economic. Like, arts journalism is in a huge crisis, and I feel extremely lucky to be at a place where that's actually the way in which arts criticism functions. That said, I read recaps all the time. I find them very
Yeah.
useful. But I'm really interested in experimental ways of doing recaps. Like, do you ever see the Tom and Lorenzo guys? They do recaps of Mad Men, for instance, where they analyze it through pictures of, they do a lot of visual analysis of people's outfits, and they mix the photos in, and they do all sorts of captions. I mean, it's just very interesting to me because there is something very dense about reading
Right.
a textual summary of a show. But then there's also like live tweeting, which is a
Yeah.
whole different kind of thing, and this way of people throwing blog posts back and forth at one another.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's interesting because it reshapes all the time. But the origins of my criticism really are, to some extent, television pity conversations, which were anonymous. and included a lot of journalists and people in Hollywood, but you couldn't tell who was who. I mean, they had consistent names, but because those were these very intense back and forth posts by people who were passionate to the point of insanity about shows they both loved and hated. But their recaps, even though they were famous for their recaps, I didn't read them, even though a lot of them were very good. They were 17 pages long. Like it was really one of these things. It was like a video game walkthrough,
right,
you know, where
right.
like so
longer than the script of the
But I mean, I'm glad that I can write this way. I also do feel like I'm lucky to have a job in which it operates this way. But I'm always struggling with the question of writing a long essay doesn't mean I know how to write it or when to write it in TV, because one of the major things about television is that it's episodic and in most cases goes on for seasons over years. And so it's not like a movie or a book where when you review it, you're reviewing the whole thing. Like a person made it, they gave it to you, you consumed it, and then you responded. So I'm always struggling with the question of like, am I writing about the whole show, one episode, 2/3 of the way through a drama? Guessing at what will happen, you know, it's a built-in conundrum, and I think it's part of the reason that the internet is such an important part of this, because it enables people to actually write about TV in a way that's matched to TV.
Right, serialized.
Yeah.
Yeah. You said in the long form interview that you did that you think that there's like a false objectivity that's like invoked in many TV critics, and not just critics of media.
Not TV critics, really, but just criticism. There's a notion,
right.
Yeah.
I think that like a lot of people find it really difficult, I think myself included, to like talk about something that you feel a lot of things about without like trying to sound like your opinion is the right, it's fact. I was just wondering like how you think this false objectivity manifests and how you yourself avoid it. Like,
well, I mean, for one thing, I mean, the thing I always say is I feel like I love writing criticism. Criticism is complicated in terms of its tone, I think, because it is a form of theater. I mean, writing criticism is meant to also entertain the reader as well as engage with them and challenge them. And you can make all sorts of choices about tone. I have a distaste for people who write as though they don't ever feel anything about the art or as though they're coming from on high. But I certainly have written my share of arrogant from on high pieces, so I can't exactly say that all my pieces come from some sort of like, you know, like humble and loving space. I mean, I feel like I've written some really harsh pans, and those have that quality of like a person like going like this on a table or arguing like drunkenly at a party to try to convince somebody. But I mean, really what it comes down to is just the fact that, I mean, I have certain values about TV, but I try to write in a way that it expresses the complexity of the fact that I think certain things, but I also feel certain things and sometimes change my mind about them, or sometimes have contradictions built in, and it's not a mathematical analysis. I mean, nobody writes objective reviews.
Right.
I actually wrote a review this year where I wrote something, and then I'd always wanted to do this, and I hadn't found a show to do it with, but I wrote I think, overly critical, you know, it's like sometimes I change my mind about things later on, or even if I agree with myself, I didn't like the tone of the earlier review. And the one review I wrote this year that I was like, I wrote this review of The Nick that I was after I'd seen the first few episodes, and then I changed my mind about the show. I'd written a fairly critical review of it, or frustrated review, and then I changed my mind about it. So I wrote a blog post called I Changed My Mind About The Nick, because I was like, I want there to be a way for people to talk about not just their, and then also sometimes I haven't changed my mind about a show, but the show has changed. So I had a different response to the first 5 episodes of Scandal than I did to Scandal in its second season. So I was lucky enough to get to write a second review that appreciated what the show did. But on the other hand, I have to pick and choose. You know, I can't keep revisiting the like 7 shows I think are fantastic and just write about them every 3 episodes. So.
Yeah. Well, you also said upstairs that like writing about TV or criticizing TV is a way of celebrating TV. It's like it's a way of holding TV up to high standards and making sure that it, or helping it get there.
This was specifically my justification for writing A Cruel Pan.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, I mean, I've talked about this before, but we were talking about poetry. I have a poetry background, and I used to review poetry in the New York Times book review, and I actually decided that I I decided that I personally couldn't do that. Like, I felt uncomfortable writing critical reviews of poetry in the New York Times Book Review because poetry is made by one person for no money with a tiny audience. Mm-hmm. And to review something with even a mixed review in that big a space felt like it had a kind of cruelty that just it made me, and I also felt like if I couldn't write a negative review, I couldn't write a positive review, because
Mm-hmm.
the way of respecting an art form, I mean, this isn't to say I don't think people should review poetry. I do, and I love poetry, but what I was saying was that TV is the opposite to me,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel strangely relatively comfortable writing very critical reviews because TV is made collaboratively for an enormous amount of money and is hugely condescended to historically as an art form. So I was saying writing a pan is a way of praising the medium.
Right.
Because historically there are different kinds of critics of TV, many of whom were very good, but oftentimes things were really overpraised for showing even just like a tiny bit of ambition. And at this point historically, like, people should desire great television.
Mm-hmm.
It's been made, it clearly can be made. So I try to, when I pan something, I try to pick something that I think is a legitimate target that has greater meaning than just the show. But, I think that everybody acknowledges there is something fun about reading a really negative review that kind of digs in and isn't all on the one hand, on the other hand. And some shows, I mean, I was mad at The Newsroom when it started. I wasn't the only one.
Lots of people are mad at The Newsroom.
Some people love that show, though, and I always feel it was so hard to talk about, like, with, because you don't want to take away somebody's love for something.
Right,
but
right.
I really disliked the show. I wrote a pan of it. I don't know.
Yeah. Do you think that TV criticism and, like, being in the, like, late golden age, or if you would, just people who spend, like, their whole lives debating if we're in the golden age still or not, but do you think that the stigma against TV as being a junk form or something that critics slum in is over, or do you think it's persisting? Or
I think it's over to some extent. I think TV is in an incredibly strange state right now, which is confusing to me as well, because I've basically spent years with this project where I was like, I need to try to create the kind of rhetoric and TV criticism that detaches itself from comparisons, endless comparisons to novels and movies. Mm-hmm. It's a boring way to talk about TV. And what we need is the language to talk about TV as a medium and its specific qualities. The fact that it's made by groups of people rather than one solitary auteur, the fact that it takes place over time, the fact that it's both an episode and a season and a whole show, the history of the specific genres of TV, like the sitcom and the procedural, and how people relate to those things. So for years and also specifically the fact that I feel like there's this tendency to praise things that fit into these prestige categories in people's heads and overlook things that actually have other equally ambitious or interesting qualities but look junkier to people. So I've been trying to do that. Anyway, it turns out in the last 2 years, TV has started to strongly resemble, when things are released all in one season on Netflix, it changes the nature of TV. It's no longer taking place over time, and it's only episodic in a superficial way. And the other thing is that I often have talked about how economically TV, including great shows like Buffy, don't necessarily look great or cinematic, but are still worth celebrating. And you don't just praise a show that looks pretty like Boardwalk Empire versus a show that looks junky like The Fosters or something. But there's been an enormous influx of independent directors into television in a way that's radically changed TV and challenged me as a writer, because I don't have a cinema studies background. And I always came to it as a TV person, not as a movies person who was a convert to TV. I'm really trying to raise my game in this area, because I feel like, in this piece I actually talked a lot specifically about how the episode was filmed. But more and more I'm feeling like this is just like a radical, like it's a shock to the entire system of the medium, because then you have Jane Campion making Top of the Lake. You have this humongous thing. I was just at Sundance and I kept thinking about this, because I was like, I keep trying to detach TV and movies, but now specifically with independent film, there's this enormous influence that's taking place. So I think for all critics, that's something that people are wrestling with, is how to be able to respond to a medium that is actually changing and has tiny audiences and big audiences, and there's web distribution. It's amazing.
I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience, but then we can get back and talk about transparent maybe for the last little bit.
You guys can ask questions too. We'll bring them back.
Yeah, you can call on them in the back, Cats. Okay, so start with Jess.
So I was really interested in what you first started talking about, how when your introduction to TV criticism or to talking about TV online, the conversation that was happening was so sort of centralized in media around this one show, which was The Sopranos. And now I was looking at a chart the other day about how many new scripted dramas there were at the start of this season, and it's like well over 100 now. And I'm wondering like how, as a critic, you negotiate the shift from there being this one like very centralized conversation where it seems obvious, like, okay, I should be talking about this.
Shows to talk about.
And when there is this like huge proliferation of different conversations, like how do you choose like where you want to plug into and like who you want to be talking to and what you want to be talking about?
I for one thing, I saw that same chart. It was put out by FX, God bless them. And I had the biggest wave of relief when I saw it, because I realized that, especially for the last 8 months or so, I really have been struggling with this question of, I have this model in my head where I think I want to theoretically keep going from cable to network, comedy to drama, big show everybody's talking about, small thing nobody knows about and I have to tell them about, and then every 4 or 5 have a critical piece so that it's not all just me talking about things I like, but actually talking about larger issues. But picking and choosing is impossible. And I watch a lot of TV and I try to stay up to date on what's going on. When I saw that chart, I was like, I am off the hook. Like, I can't watch all that. Nobody can. Like, and I actually felt a lot better, because I'm not trying to get lazy about this, because I actually do want to figure out what to watch and what to prioritize. But for instance, I never really caught up on Sons of Anarchy, even though I knew it was an interesting show. And sometimes people would ask me about reviewing it, and it was... I felt better when I saw the list, because I was just like, it's just triage. Like, we all have to decide what to prioritize. And I actually am grateful for Twitter for this, because I often feel like when there's a huge global community of people who are interested in ambitious television, and I feel like occasionally I'll sort of throw out a thing and say, what's new that I should know about? And I feel like I actually get in this weird sort of like in Minority Report where it's like reaching around and trying to pick things out so that I'm able to identify shows that are doing new things. Because I mean, it should be my priority to identify stuff that is like interesting and altering the larger medium, but I also felt relieved, because I felt like I'm gonna miss things and I just have to live with that. Like, on the other hand, it's also like, it does make it hard for TV fans to figure out what to watch. And it's funny, people are always very sentimental about must-see TV and everybody having one show that they all talked about, but my feeling about it is that was not good, because a show that appeals to everybody is often not an interesting show. I mean, I'm not saying it couldn't be an interesting show. Some of those shows are fantastic. MASH is a really great show. But experiments and odd things and things created by individual creators and things created by a diversity of creators are often never shows that are going to appeal to enormous audiences. And so the fact that there are 3 million shows actually makes it more likely that you can hit on something that changes you. Like, and there's only a handful of shows every year that do that, but they're there in the massive things. Like, I could name like 5 shows this year that were the shows that made me think TV is different, like made me try to figure it out.
Yes, right there.
Oh, there's someone all the way back here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, the mic is bad.
Hi. Well, for you, this is like the voice of God. You don't know where it's coming from.
Yeah, no, this is great.
No, but I'm a senior.
Tell me what to do.
My name's Gabe. I'm raising my hand. But my question was, so people obviously like reviewing television, like a lot of art is very subjective, and so I'm interested in like the consistency like between like how you try to analyze episodes, and I know that you're associated to something called the approval matrix, I think. So,
yes.
So I was wondering if you could just, I know this is probably a complicated topic, but if you could maybe just, I'm not familiar with it, so if you could describe like what it is and kind of what criteria or how you came about to make it?
I've been at the New Yorker for like 3 or 4 years, and before that, I was for several years at New York Magazine, which was a wonderful job. I was the head of I was the culture editor. I oversaw the culture coverage. I was the editor there, and then actually after I had my first kid, I became a writer there, and I wrote all sorts of different things, including profiles and things like that. And eventually, I started writing the TV criticism. Because the wonderful critic John Leonard, who wrote the TV criticism, sadly died. And so after his death, I was writing TV criticism for then. So I did a bunch of different things. But the only thing I will ever be remembered for doing for New York, which I'm perfectly happy about, is creating the approval matrix, which is this charticle that is essentially a square thing that has 2 lines in the middle. What are those called? Axes, 2 axes. I was like, vectors? Like I got all confused. And one of them the top one goes from highbrow to lowbrow, and the sideways one goes from brilliant to despicable. And despicable is a horrible word, and I can tell you about the creation of the thing. Anyway, and then all of these cultural things from every category go on this. It is an deliberately infuriating thing, and it became immensely popular and then was copied a lot. So it's very satisfying if you're a magazine editor to create a charticle that both infuriates people and causes them to copy it. That's pretty much your whole goal. But I mean, one thing I do think that people sometimes miss about the approval matrix is that we actually really did have a philosophy for this, even though it's undeniably an obnoxious idea. And part of it was putting all medium considered high or low, whatever, in the same place. Because part of the idea was that when we were redesigning the section, it went books, TV, theater, and like you figure everybody would flip to the section that they were most interested in, visual art. And I wanted something at the end that combined them and jokingly compared them, because it says our deliberately unreliable guide. But also it's created to argue with, which I do think is the nature of a certain kind of reductive criticism, because it's not about where things are on the matrix, it's about where they are in relationship to everything else. So when you look at it, you go, wait, why is the Oscars highbrow? Like, what does that even mean? Like, or why is a graphic novel in a certain place like that? And it's meant to, question the notion of highbrow and lowbrow. Anyway, that's my explanation of the matrix, but it was a really fun thing. I created it, and then I hired Adam Sternberg, who is a wonderful writer and editor who was there, and he became the genius of the thing. And so it ended up being this very collaborative, fun thing about basically writing jokes. Some people love it, some people hate it, but my other colleague there, Chris Bananas, who also worked on it with us when I was there, and we would gather and punch up each other's jokes. He saw somebody on the subway circling things on it to try to find things to do. So I thought that was very oddly exciting. But it was a while ago. It was at my previous job, and there are other people who oversee the matrix now. So they do a wonderful job, but if there's stuff that you want to argue with where it is on the matrix, don't ask me. Because sometimes people tweet to me about it, and I'm like, I haven't been there in 4 years.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, how's it going? I'm Mark. Nice
Hello.
to meet you. So my question kind of goes off of what she was asking earlier about having a lot, too many choices, essentially.
Too many cooks.
Yeah, and...
Have you guys seen that viral video? Look it up when you get home if you have not seen it. You'll be a different person at the other side.
I have a feeling, since you're a critic, a lot of people ask you for recommendations.
Yes.
And that's one of my favorite parts about being a TV-holic, of matching people with TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what your opinion is on kind of trying to stay current and modern, but also going back and watching historical TV, like the greats shows. I've going back and watching The West Wing or All in the Family, or I've always been meaning to watch MASH.
Definitely.
How much should you balance the historical context and have a good base? I
think this is incredibly important, and it's something I'm always trying to strengthen in myself, is my knowledge of TV history. And the way my contract works is I write, I generally write a column every 2 weeks, but occasionally I write a longer column. And I always try to schedule the longer ones so that I get to use the extra space to do a lot of reading and watching. I've been going to the Museum of Television and Radio, and I've really tried to self-educate on this. I had some knowledge of TV history. I was just interested in it personally. Also, I'm old enough that I experienced some of it. But but especially early TV, I really felt like I needed to understand it more deeply, and the difficulty is actually being able to watch things, because often people have these corroded cultural impressions of shows, and you really find new things when you watch them. So I got to write a piece about All in the Family and the Norman Lear shows specifically, which was so satisfying because it really was a moment that I could actually think about 70s television. But as far as recommending them to people, it is tricky because, there are certain shows that I think are just, if people haven't watched Freaks and Geeks, I think they should watch it, or My So-Called Life. Like, those are one-season shows that are brilliant, and they're the formative influence on much that is ambitious about television. And at the time were a little overlooked because they were considered teen shows. So yes, I think those shows are great. But my personal feeling is, I mean, there are shows that I love and kind of would like everyone to watch, but people shouldn't watch things that they don't like. I feel I once wrote this piece about having a 3-episode philosophy, where it's like, if there's a show that is a fantastic show, and is the particular kind of show that I find to be like a challenging show that throws people off and teaches people how to view it because it's different than other things, I just think people are required to watch 3 episodes. If it doesn't kick in, why watch it? Like, I just don't think people are required. There's so much that people should watch the things that challenge them, but at the same time, life's too short. I mean, I think that's true with anything. But it is interesting because sometimes on Twitter, people ask me for suggestions, and I try to gauge, what they're into. But the truth is, the whole algorithm is rigged because I'm really just going to recommend, I mean, it's not true, but like, I will try to get everyone to watch Enlightened, even if they don't seem like an enlightened person, like the HBO show Enlightened. I thought it was great. I'll find a way that their taste actually requires them to watch it.
Yeah.
So.
Actually, Allie asked a question that I'm just going to repeat because I'm interested in it.
Yeah.
Do you have like a concept of what the TV canon is?
Oh. I've written literally every year at the website, they make us write a top 10 list. And every year at the New Yorker specifically, I found a way to write in a juvenile post about why I refuse to write a top 10 list. But the actual answer to why I refuse to write a top 10 list is I used to work at New York Magazine, and I was the culture editor. And I wrote a lot of lists, and I actually really do have a kind of native revulsion to list writing. And so I do think that there's a canon of the great television shows, but I'm probably loath to express what it is, except that's ridiculous, because of course it's not like I don't think some shows are better than others. I do, or are the most important shows. But that's an interesting question. I've never actually made a point to sit down and do it. I think part of my resistance is actually that there are so many people that I feel really kind of have this grandiose desire to say, here are the 5 great shows, and often they're the same shows that, and they have some of the qualities that I find, limiting in talking about TV. And often they haven't watched a lot of other shows. If there's one thing that drives me crazy, it's the people who keep telling me this is the best show that's ever been on television. And I'm like, you definitely haven't watched all the other shows. So it's fine to say it's a brilliant show. But there is a real desire to nail down, the greatness factor. I don't know. I think I'm confused about this clearly, because I sort of feel both things. And this really came out when I wrote my terrible anti-top 10 thing this year. The first 2 were great, and then this one, or maybe it was the 4th one, I don't know. I just sort of gave in and kind of listed a bunch of things. So it's hard to do.
I hear a lot about the big 4.
Which are the big 4?
The big
Sopranos?
4, The Sopranos, The Wire, Mad Men, and Breaking Bad.
That's crazy.
Man anti-heroes.
Yeah, I mean, look. I think those are brilliant. It's interesting. I would throw in. So wait, people would say the Sopranos. They leave out Deadwood. That's interesting.
They do.
Yeah.
Or these are the people that talk to me.
I once wrote a piece a couple of years ago called. We were supposed to write a piece for New York Magazine that was a 10-year wrestling with the form. It was great for me as a TV person because the last 10 years before that had been incredible. And I wrote this piece called When TV Became Art. And I did say that The Wire was the best television show of all time. So, which at the time I felt in certain ways it was. But I actually feel in the fullness of time more like I felt in my first anti-top 10 list, where I said, when you make comparisons between things so unlike, it ends up feeling very strange. And so I was making these jokes about like, which do you like better, paella or democracy? It's just this odd thing where like a small, flawed, and beautiful show might be in certain ways more powerful than a grand and perfect show. And the thing about The Wire is that it really does fit pretty much every category that people think of as prestige drama. Like, for one thing, it's a drama. People way underrate comedy. It drives me crazy. There are like 20 brilliant comedies that are on TV all over the place. People don't know how to praise comedy as something great. Occasionally they do if it's something like Louie, which is a notorious independent movie comedy. But ambitious sitcoms don't get that same kind of praise. Like stylized shows with formulaic elements, shows that are highly collaborative. I mean, I wrote a little bit about this in my Sex and the City piece. But I think that that's the stuff that really narrows people's appreciation of ambition and artistry in television, is reducing it to that. This is not to say that I don't like those shows. I actually am almost the most proud of a piece I wrote about The Sopranos, which I still think is a really a brilliant show that changed me a lot. But I don't expect it to be everybody's favorite show. I have a colleague who loves Deadwood so much, and it just wasn't, I mean, I love Deadwood, but it's not my show, like in a passionate way, and Buffy is. Like, I literally could talk about Buffy the Vampire Slayer for hours, but it's not that, I think it's a fantastic show, but I would have trouble forcing somebody to say, you know, I don't know. There are too many ways to look at this. It's very prismatic for me to feel like the best way to approach the art form is a kind of like layering thing where you go like, here are the 10 shows. Here are the 20 shows beneath those that are also very important. Here are the shows that led to those shows. Like, it just, I don't know. I think that it takes away a lot of the pleasure and passion of actually engaging with the series themselves, instead sort of regarding them in this sort of numerical way or in terms of their weight. And frankly, this is the last thing I'll say about that, but to me, part of the problem is that people feel, understandably, historically, defensive about their love of television, because television was historically considered junk. So I feel like people had to come up with all sorts of intellectual and emotional tools to praise it, and a lot of it had to do with making these weighty, grand statements about and I always joke about this, but the early great television of that exact anti-hero masculinity dramas, the whole thing was saying, it's the new Scorsese, it's as good as Dickens. And to me, that was all about anxiety about loving television and about justifying it. And I do feel like people are past that now, and it's great, so that people can talk about something like High Maintenance. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it's an amazing, tiny, strange web series that Vimeo sort of picked up that's about a pot dealer in New York, and is very unlike anything else on television and doesn't share a lot of those qualities, and that people can actually enjoy it rather than looking at it and saying, this is I don't even know what it would be like. What would be the comparison? So I think that's very freeing, that you actually get to talk about what's brilliant in something without that enormous burden of greatness, about having to acclaim it with greatness. Yeah.
A couple more. Oh my goodness. Hey, Mom.
Hi. So when you talk about the history of television, or when you study the history of television, and certainly each of us in the room can sort of talk about the show that, or shows that shaped us or shaped our society of that time and had a social impact. One, do you think television is more socially impactful or impacting our society or the way that we live as opposed to other, and you were speaking about Norman Lear, and we can go through other things that certainly changed our society. MASH would have been one of them as well. And in terms of greatness factor as a critic, are you more inclined to say it's a great show if it's more socially impactful?
No. I actually, to the second one, definitely no. I mean, in in academia, I feel like it's very interesting to me. I have a limited knowledge of the way that TV studies and movie studies work on the academic level, but the impression I've gotten is that movies are dealt with as an art form, and historically TV is dealt with as a sociological subject. And I'm interested in the politics of television in a lot of different ways. And I'm also interested in doing like gender and racial analysis and all those kinds of things. But I'm most interested in TV like as an art form and not as a medium for ideas. It's not to say that it isn't a medium for ideas, but I think that is the way TV was viewed within the first few decades of TV, partially because of the way it was distributed. It was on like a big console in the living room that the whole family watched. It started out as a live thing rather than a tape thing. Then it became taped. There were only a few stations. There were these huge fights during the 70s. There were fights at various different junctures about what it would do to children. For a long time, it was viewed essentially as something pleasurable but sort of disgusting and harmful, and maybe a little, sad and addictive, like that you did solo. And I think that struggle with the notion of that TV should be socially progressive and help inform and educate people created a lot of very interesting shows, but it also created a lot of super didactic things, some of which I have enormous affection for, like all the very special episodes of the 80s. One thing I will say is that it's funny because I do think that there's a narrative of progress that people often apply to art forms and that I've been guilty of myself in talking about TV becoming more ambitious. The truth is, when you look at the shows of the 70s, they have a very direct relationship to politics in the world in a way that a lot of current shows don't. And there's something great and aggressive and that I do think has been lost in some ways. At the same time, it was interesting to revisit the Norman Lear shows, which were so important, but sometimes it was a little hard to inhabit what the audience was like at the time. And the thing I wrote about All in the Family specifically, I don't want to go into like a long, this is my theory, which is mine thing, but I had written a lot about bad fan dynamics, which I've talked about in terms of, I like to write a lot about audience relationships with TV and a way of talking about varied ways people interpret things, often in contradiction with one another. With the anti-hero show specifically, I've been really fascinated by that there's a subset of viewers, for instance, who view Walt on Breaking Bad as a hero, not an anti-hero. There's definitely people who just root for him straightforwardly, think Skyler is an enormous bitch. It's always very disturbing when you read the response online and you think to yourself, how is the show creating that response? Is the show responsible for that response? What kind of fantasy is this? Who is this about and who is it for? And in the Norman Lear piece, what I was writing about was that All in the Family was sort of the first progenitor of the bad fan response, because it was the discovery with that show, which was intended in a very straightforward way by Norman Lear in some ways, to challenge people's racism and to, present on screen the conflicts that were taking place in people's families and the political mood of the country. But there were definitely people who watched Archie Bunker as a representative of their own feelings. And as a cathartic person, finally somebody is saying what I actually feel about things. And, you can't control audience response, but that's actually kind of what makes that show a rich show. It's also probably what made that show a hit show, because there were so many different ways to watch it so that you could get liberals and conservatives and bigots and anti-bigots watching the show in different ways. And so, because network television is always a hunt for ratings, well, that's one solution to the mass ratings thing, is make a show that people can watch in several different ways. So with that show, it is interesting to watch that show because you can't watch it outside the context of the way in which it's meant to be educational, but it functions also as something different. But one thing I will say about modern shows is that one thing I really admire, even though I said that I don't rate shows by whether they spread good messages. I'd hate to do that, and I try to fight that in myself. But there are shows that I feel like do this so skillfully that I admire this about the show. Orange is the New Black is, to me, masterful at being a pulpy, very sexual, very funny, very aggressive portrait of the women in the prison system. And each season, they have basically implanted 2 or 3 clearly themes that could be in a article in The Nation about the specifics of the prison system and woven them through. One of them about, for instance, elderly women just being kicked out of the prison onto the street. Like, you could make a documentary about that, or you can make Orange is the New Black. Like, Joss Whedon about Buffy said, I did a profile of him at one point, and he said, I could have made a black and white documentary called Buffy the Lesbian Separatist Slayer, but I wanted to make a mass show that would appeal to an enormous audience and enter people's dreams. I mean, he had political ideas for the show. To me, the question is, are the political ideas part of the story in an organic way, or do they swamp it and then you just get an episode of I'm sorry, what was the show with Michael Keaton? Family Ties. I once tried to rewatch Family Ties, which is very much of my generation, and that is an impossible to rewatch show because it is so preachy. So yeah, that's the answer to the question: is if people can spread those ideas in a skillful and beautiful way, the way that, say, Transparent does, then I'm all for it. But judging the show itself as a kind of delivery system makes me itch.
Let's take a question from the back. All the way back. Still going back.
Hi, I'm Julia. So I write about and study reality television.
Yes.
And I'm interested in, its absence from the conversation sort of when we're assigning.
I know, it's terrible. We were just talking about how many shows there are. It is a big problem for me. I actually am very interested in reality TV. I was very interested in it earlier in my career and wrote about it some very early on. Also, as to present my bona fides, I watched maybe the first 15 seasons of The Real World, and I was a web watcher of Big Brother during its first notoriously boring season. When I put they used to call them the hamsters. I would put the square in the corner of my screen when I was a freelance writer and watch them. So I'm not unaware of reality television. I wish I had written more about reality television. I've written a handful of columns. I once wrote a column on Big Brother. I wrote a short thing on RuPaul's Drag Race. I think I wrote one on cooking shows, which have a lot of reality things, and I think I wrote one other. But I don't think I've written about this sufficiently, and I also feel like I haven't had enough time to watch enough of the shows. I mean, one thing I've written about is the fact that reality and scripted TV have an enormous relationship to one another. They're not really separate genres, but I've always found it hilarious that reality has essentially replaced scripted television as the punching bag medium for people. So it's now like the shameful, dirty, fun thing, and now scripted TV is the prestige auteur thing. But, you know, as an example, The Office is essentially, the whole mockumentary format is an allergic reaction to reality TV by TV writers who were angry, maybe, at the rise of reality TV. And so they created this brilliant show, The British Office, that's essentially like a satirical expression, but that uses reality TV's aesthetic forms, like all the shifting cameras and the confessionals and everything. So, yeah, maybe it's a critique of it, but it also is... it uses what it does artistically. There's a lot of other things that, you know, like I would like to write about. The one thing I did write on reality early in my career when I was much younger, there used to be a magazine called Radar, and I'm very proud of a piece I wrote for the second episode of Radar, second issue of Radar. I flew out to LA and I wrote about, there's a bar out there that it was owned by Mike Boogie of, I guess he was Big Brother. And all the reality TV stars hung out there, and it was just about like the strata of reality TV stars who were all sleeping with one another and living as roommates and had their own hierarchy of which shows were better than the other shows. Like the Survivors were so arrogant. It's like they were like the Harvard people or something. They were like, that was an athletic show, a competition. The Bachelor people, there's just a bunch of silly girls. So I don't know. That was really fun, and it makes me wish that I could write more about it. But I think it's just a timing thing. Like I won't write about something that I don't have substantive knowledge of, and I need to sit down and watch it the same way I watched all the seasons of The Walking Dead in 1 week. I need to like What show should I be writing about, reality-wise?
Sorry, I've lost the microphone. But,
I'm sorry.
What show? I don't know. I guess I'm just more interested interested in this hierarchical idea of TV, and it's just how reality TV has become synonymous with trash TV, and despite the fact it makes up the majority of television programming. And
I mean, I do have ambivalent feelings about it, because the reason it makes up the majority of television programming is, and this is is an economic reason. Like, I mean, the reason The Real World was created as a show was because they wanted to make a teen sitcom on MTV, and it's too expensive to have people write it and make a soap opera. So they did a brilliant thing, and they got a documentary maker and a soap opera maker, and they combined forces, and then they got a bunch of unpaid 19-year-olds, and then they threw them into New York. I mean, that's it worked. It's really fascinating. But this is like I'm like a curmudgeonly old person, but I'm like, reality TV actually used to be real. Like, it wasn't scripted at the beginning. It actually was an offshoot of cinema verite and documentary. But I think part of my frustration is it is hard for me to. I mean, I should respond, but it's tricky because, I mean, reality shows are so much more steered by the artificial story than they used to be. I don't know. I should write more about reality TV. If you guys have recommendations, I will write a column about a good show. I try to find the right one.
I think we have time for one more.
Sorry.
Is that okay?
Sure.
Hi. So I'm really interested in women comedy, and recently I've just been watching a lot of Broad City. I was kind
It's
of
on tonight.
Yeah.
It's on tonight, and one of them was tweeting. She was like, "I'm really excited and scared about this episode." I was like,
I love that show, and I was kind of
amazing.
wondering about your thoughts about how it is similar to Girls and Louie, and why a show like that might necessarily not be taken as seriously as Louie is, for example, even though it's amazing.
First of all, Broad City should not complain that it's not taken too seriously, because man, that is one of the several hot shows. I went to a performance in Brooklyn where I live. I went to the Bell House, and Abby and Alana came to perform as part of this thing. I swear to God, it was like the Beatles. Like, it was so crazy. I was like, I hope they don't go insane. The love for them was so enormous. I think the thing about Broad City, also, I'm very excited that Amy Poehler produced that show. I find that really fascinating.
Very exciting.
Like, because in terms of women in comedy, man, it has been a great 3 years. It's been a great 3 years for comedy in general, but there really is this explosive range of voices. It's really good. I mean, it's just a good thing. And there's Amy Schumer is really good, and I don't know, there's just a lot of different interesting things. Like, not every show is to every taste. Like, I'm interested in what Mindy is doing on network. Like, network stuff is interesting in general. I don't know if you guys are watching the last season of Parks and Recreation, but it's been weirdly good. Like, kind of almost, it's almost a cult in its over quality. Like, it's almost suspicious, because it was always a good show, but it's kind of perfect. It's unnerving, and it's so wonderful to see a show going out in its final season like that. But when that show began, I don't know if you remember this, but people literally were publishing think pieces about whether Amy Poehler could hold a comedy, whether you could have a woman at the center of a network comedy. It was insane. It was really, really dispiriting and weird. Nobody would be doing that now. I mean, I do think that Tina Fey and Amy Poehler did a lot. But Broad City, there's something about that show, their chemistry and the dirtiness, and it's like warm but tough and surreal. And I like to watch Broad City in the morning. It's kind of like my version of Wake and Bake. Like I said, like where it's like, because I will start the day, like I'll get up and get my kids out to school, and my husband is also really into the show, and so I will just kind of turn it on. It's a half hour. It's very satisfying. But anyway, this is just a sort of a kind of inchoate answer. But I do think it's the part that's also thrilling to me is the rise of female ensembles, so it's not just a show about one woman. I don't know if you guys have seen Getting On, which might not be to everyone's taste, but it's an HBO show, weirdly about a geriatric home. It seems like the most depressing subject for a comedy that could ever be. And I didn't love the first season. I liked it, but I thought that it had kind of a funky tonal mix. I thought the second season was amazing. And it has old women that would never have been on TV, just in terms of like the way that networks used to cast women and think about comedy and stuff like that. And it has dark humor. It can be very touching. It has Niecy Nash, who's really great. I mean, that's the kind of thing that it just seems like the environment is so different that show, while it seems strange, is no longer an outlier. And the great thing about it is now unlike when Girls came out, each show doesn't have to stand for everyone and be like the proof of that you can have a woman on television or a woman comedy, or that everybody has to identify with the main character. I just think that hopefully it will continue to improve. I don't know if you guys are watching Jane the Virgin, which is not exactly a comedy, but I just watched, it's like an unusually good first season of a show. And the other thing, though, is that with comedy, there's no longer distinction, right? Like, and also, I always say this, but Sopranos is hilarious. Like, it's kind of a weird thing. Like, the distinction between comedy and drama is not so clear to me. So when we're talking about women in comedy, it doesn't just have to be sitcoms. However, I will like to say, just because I'm in Philadelphia, that I always think Dee on Always Sunny, I always say, is the most unappreciated female character on TV, because that show is one of my favorite shows, and I really do think that's a great character. And she started as a boring character, right, for the first 4 episodes. She was like the voice of reason. It just shows that when you don't have to be the voice of reason, everything changes. I don't know if that answered your question. Is there stuff that I should know about to watch?
Or in terms of female comedy?
Yeah, or in terms of, yeah.
I'm not sure. I've just kind of like been trying to get more into the genre lately. But one thing I was thinking about recently is like the Mini Project, which I also love.
Yeah.
I remember she was kind of complaining that she felt like her show had a smaller viewership, and she like didn't know how to make more people appreciate it. Do you think that's just like the nature of what she's
It's network TV. It's just different. Like it's like such a different experience for people making it. You know, it's funny because TV has always been between a mass form and an art form, and I always felt very frustrated by the fact that TV writers are supposed to talk about the ratings things get. I'm like, that has nothing to do with whether the show is good. It could get tiny ratings and be a great show, but it does make a difference about whether it stays on the air. And with something like Mindy, I do think it needs to be understood in that context, because they're under completely different kinds of pressure. They can't do some crazy avant-garde thing. But I think Mindy is a really weird show. Like, I think sometimes it's hilarious and sometimes it kind of stalls and it's strange, but it feels different than other things. And not just because Mindy looks different than other people on TV, which is exciting in its own way, but also like her comic sensibility, which has this like sourness and femininity and this sort of like pungent kind of punchy force, and I don't know. I love her stuff, and I'm interested to see what else she'll do. I hope that the show survives, but so many of these things are just an economic luck of the draw. The only reason 30 Rock stayed on the air was because NBC was falling apart. They would have absolutely canceled that thing if they could, but they had to keep it because they had no schedule. So sometimes you just have to pray that the network is so weak it can't cancel your favorite show.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I hope you'll join us for our reception in the back.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.